Have you ever wondered how to make someone look old? In this video, I'm going to go through some ideas for what you could do or think about in the process of drawing your basic head to describe age, outside of what I think is pretty traditional, which would be wrinkles. So sometimes wrinkles are cool, but can get a little overused. So it might be more fun to think about some different areas of the face that we could tackle or look at a little bit that could say age in a slightly different way. So I think that the easiest way to think about age is really the difference of the skull being present or absent. So in someone that's youthful or younger, I'm going to see a lot more fat and much less skull, or said differently, a lot more soft surface and much less hard surface. So we have the example here of Marlon Brando.
Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me.
So some of the basic steps I would like to get to in terms of just setting a head up where I'd be comfortable looking for those ideas. Right? So I want to lay in most of the simple representations of larger planes in the skull. So where are the eye sockets? Where is the basic blocky shape of the nose? Where is the mouth? Most importantly, I would say, is where are the cheekbones too. So we're going to do a little cutout over here, and then from this area or this plane, I can start to develop my cheek and jaw. But my jaw here is this, and then maybe in this we'll look at the cheekbone more as a simplified pair of glasses that may come from that top point of the jaw or bottom of the ear, and then make a decisive turn with that front plane of the face to become the bottom of the socket. This would be the temple. And the awareness of the skull here would be pretty important. You don't have to draw it exactly, but knowing the important moments or points where you're going to see skin or flesh start to pinch or hang a bit can make an impact for creating age or avoiding making your drawings look too old. This would be my basic denture sphere. We could put a mass in this area, which would be a summary form for the teeth and what the teeth are contributing to the front plane of the face. And then below that, we would have the chin. So the chin can also be some kind of simple form, egg, cylinder, something just to summarize the impact that the look of the skeleton or the bone would have in that area. So what I would avoid to make the aged face, an over-reliance on wrinkle or lines like these, I think can become noisy to your face, and in some cases can maybe start to dispel or hurt the feeling of form or the illusion of form by becoming too much of a distraction, disassociation from the larger surfaces. Points I do like to focus on would be, especially the area around the cheek. So that's something in this that I really want to draw your attention to, specifically this area, right? So the idea that when we're younger, right, we'll have this cashew form of the transition of that cheek from side into front, hidden. Right, so if we just kind of slide down briefly, you can see a younger version of Marlon Brando's face. Tried to find a similar view with some similar lighting, although not nearly as harsh. But if I look at this is completely smoothed out, right? So it's very difficult to kind of see that plane change. I can because of the gradation of value that kind of smooths that turn out. But look at some of the contrasts, in between that, where we would see in this very different feeling to surface. Surface in this one is very kind of wobbly, ins and outs that are much more dramatic and impactful. So the cheekbone becomes key to understanding some of what's happening here. Revealing the presence of this bone, I think, automatically ages your figure, whereas the youthful version of this same face would have fat that covers and pulls up and then suffocates or hides that bone beneath. So specifically in this area, what would be happening is that is revealed. Now I have a top plane. That gives me a lighter area and then a slightly darker area. I always follow that up with what feels to me like a pull and a dip, where this drops down and then also feels like it's sunken, right? So it kind of made like a little arrow, and then the pull of the skin moves that way. This is because, or due to the fact that there's a piece of fat that would normally protect this that is dropped and slid down the face. So in that direction. The fat that I was discussing earlier that would normally cover all of this in the picture below in a youthful depiction of the same character is now slid, so it will fall this way and is gathered on the side of the nose, and this is called the malar fat. So if I look at this strip, which is over here, that would be where this fat has come to settle. So we have that kind of moving or shifting from high in a way that smooths out or at least evens out the presence of that bone under, and then starts to fall and collapse up against that area of the nose and becomes, in this depiction, a more parallel form. Kind of finds its way up and into the nose and then creates the line that meets with that bottom of the socket area. So that's the transformation, right? If you wanted this to be, or a character to be older, you might emphasize, again, gravity and the movement, the gesturing of those shapes of structural fat around the face. If you want it to be youthful, you could take this same piece and just smooth it up into the ear and kind of erase or hide all of those forms. The fat that surrounds the eye is also going to start to see an impact of gravity, right? So we have mostly focus on 5 major areas of fat in my course that surround and kind of cushion the eye. So regardless of the fact that there is an eye, right, we don't want to focus too much on the eyeball itself. That's not demonstrating age as much as the context here, that the fat underneath is starting to fall and push. Right, so that's creating a series of pinches or wrinkles that would also communicate the skull as a hard surface form because it's pulling tighter against it. Right, all of this bone, forehead becomes more prominent as, just like the cheek, as the fat underneath pulls and creates that tighter relationship of the skin to it. So all of this without the thought of, having to resort to creating a number of wrinkles. Again, nothing wrong with wrinkles used sparingly or used artfully, but the big picture idea of what's happening with the skull might get you to the look that you want a little bit faster. Other areas that can have an impact, seeing the face from this angle, might be if we start to look at around the area of the mouth. I know in this movie that Marlon Brando put something in his mouth to create a different cadence of speech or look to his mouth. But we'd still have in this what looks to be the appearance of the buccal fat here. So that's a pocket of fat that lives on the outside corner of your mouth that also looks like it's begun to suffer the effects of gravity and fall a bit. And then below that, we could even start to observe maybe a little bit of jowl fat, which would be a pocket that normally would be above the jawline, but in older people or in age, as we all age, will start to dip or drop below the line of the mandible. And so I always feel that breaking this straight line up, that straight line there for your jaw or your mandible shape, always gives me a good feeling or suggestion of later stage of life. So you can even feel the way that form kind of drops and then has a bit of a volume here and then kind of moves back and up and kind of re-engages with that corner area of the mouth. So the jowl fat would drop just as a result of a lifetime of talking. So the reason now that I could say that there's a difference, and specifically that kind of S curve that I made there, is that we're seeing more of the cheekbone. So as the cheekbone stands out, I get more of the reverse. Without the fat to cover it, I just have a greater look or a greater experience of the contrast of bone versus muscle, right? Versus one versus the other. So this undulating surface, right, mixed with the maintenance of a sharper, tighter corner where there'd be bone, and then contrasting that with a looser, softer sag, right, for these specific areas is always the way that I try to assign or describe difference in age. It's not that the face is melting, although it may kind of look like it. It's just that these areas of skin and fat are starting to succumb to gravity, right? Where I looked at in contrast, right now, here you could see there's almost no visible presence of the skull. I don't see much more than a slight wobble from the malar onto the mouth. I don't see a droop or a drop for any of the buccal fat. The jawline looks pretty unaffected. There's nothing that kind of dips below that. In terms of the surface here, it's a really pretty even, smooth surface. There isn't that big gap or valley as that transitions from one into the next. And then around the area of the eye, it's very kind of smooth up and in here, right? There isn't a large droop of fat herniating against the skin or starting to pull towards the bottom. So my difference in terms of understanding and working with age is really trying to address, I would say, these 3 forms, and then the presence and awareness of bone around the temple and top of the cheek. Now that we could also start to think a little bit about shadow, With the head construction, in addition to the age, what I'm thinking a lot about is how much I need to get me to my next step. All right, so next step, because head construction isn't the result, it's a means to an end. Right, so it's in order to say something else that you might venture on discovery of all the planes of the head, whether that's to say something about more rendering, about more painting, about invention. I like to work up just enough where I'd be comfortable maybe dropping a light source on top. On this side, I can also see kind of some shapes and overlap caused by the drop of some of that skin or fat under the eye. On the contour on this side, I can also see the corner of that cheek. So that cashew form over here, related, mirrored across, that would give me that same hard surface. And then beneath that, I would also look at, here's the comparable area of the malar fat. So if I take this, pick it up, drop it over, that's my fat. And then here's the nasal saddle. Here's the nose dropping down into the cartilage. Let's get our forms. Underplane for this. Here's my septum, up. Here's the nostril pulled back. And then that's going to meet up and connect with that area of the malar. You can start to see how that might have a nice gesture into it, one into the other. There's that corner of the nose. And then in this one, here's our mouth. Think about planes. There's our philtrum shape. And then this kind of heaviness to the outside corner of the mouth. So on this side where I push my buccal fat, that also would become part of the contour. So even the contour, if you're interested in the contour, more direct drawing, I am too. But the contour is always something on the inside, and it's not a thing in of itself. It's the result of a form that lives inside the face. So if I want to get a nice contour, it's disappointing, but I usually want to understand what creates it. So this over here gives me the understanding of that contour there. There's the lip, and then you could see this underplane for that area of the mouth. This would be the withdrawn or the kind of back diagonal plane under that lower lip. And then we'd have our kind of maybe an insinuation over here of that gel fat as well. So this carried over. And then we'd have our chin. We've got some ear planes in there. Not too much. I mean, in terms of aging, the ear will get larger. So if I'm looking to age a character significantly, I mostly would keep the ear proportioned between the brow, top of the brow, bottom of the nose. But for an older person, I might start to push that or extend that. And then, we could keep a pretty simple mapping of the hair, just trying to catch the surface of the head. I'm always just trying to map a graphic shape that has some perspective integration lines with the forehead or the skull. And then lighting for this one, we have maybe it's top. So I think this is an excellent example of lighting used to tell story instead of lighting used to kind of just obsess about rendering a form. So this is lighting that is intended to depict a story moment. The Godfather takes place in dark interiors where discussions and deals are made that impact the lives of many people in the film. It's a film about mortality. What is better in terms of an icon of mortality than a skull? So most of the lighting just highlights the skull. Top lit here, what do you see? I see a skull. The eyes are set into these deep shallows in the creation of socket-like forms. But back to our thinking of form, right? All of this is just sphere, cylinder, box. So what's the top of the forehead? It's just a ball. So that's going to be a soft edge. Right? So what I'm trying to do with edge is the same thing I do with line. Line or edge, I'm always thinking about the turn of surface. Right? So you think all the areas of my drawing, they always are followed by something that crosses or turns to think about the directional shift of form. Edge is the same, and I'm almost always doing the line and thinking about the way it walks across surface so that it's prepped for when I start to work with edge. So that edge stops here because it's meeting another surface that's pushing out. That would be the brow, the projection of the brow. So that becomes the bottom of that ball, in other words. And then there's a bit of a cast shadow or something from that forehead, and it turns here. This feels more like a cylinder. So that's a quicker moving form, out and over on the brow. And then the brow itself is, a little bit sharper, but maybe we could keep it at a cylinder. There is skin and muscle here. The keystone would be back here. It's in halftone mostly. But in these, I would want to think about the larger shapes that results from all of my hard work on use of line underneath. The study of age in this one is useful, right? But it's still an analytical investigation or an analytical look at how age is produced, this would be the necessary step following. What is the phenomenal result on the outside with light and shadow? So maybe we get a little cast or drop shadow off the keystone, maybe the cast shadow from the nose onto the top surface of the cheek over here. Maybe this becomes a soft edge to turn that cheek away. Maybe that becomes, this is another soft edge across that malar fat on the far side of the face. And then a lot of the edges kind of get a little blurred or more lost in here. Let's light the bottom of that nose. This would be a ball. So that has, look at the wrapping line of this, kind of goes across a ball. A lot of painters will drop the form of the nose into a redder hue just to create an association with more blood being closer to the surface in this area. In drawing or in just painting with value, sometimes you can just knock this whole area back and that'll give you the same effect. Probably wouldn't do it here though, because it's a pretty bright light that's hitting his nose. So that would jump now onto the firm shadow edge of the nostril as it turns down and under, and then that will create a cast. So that comes out over the ball of the mouth. It's a little high. I will bring it like this, up, and then dips into the philtrum shape. So again, edge that is hard edge, cast shadow edge, but still a descripted follow of surface. That jumps the top plane of the upper lip. So we cover in the head construction course the idea that the lips up and bottom or top and bottom are with a thickness. They have a top plane and a bottom plane, and that's instrumental for how I think about lighting. So this could be a box right at that same plane change, and that dives and drops into the node of the mouth. But then that form shadow creates a cast shadow, and now that's casting across the plane, the projected forward plane of the upper lip out. And then that turns into a form shadow where that lip starts to change. And so now my edge is thinking, which one is it? Cylinder, box, or sphere? This lower lip looks like a cylinder. But another thing you could do as you get further down with your edges is start to make them just darker in general, the further down the form I get, so that I think about light dissipating. Right? So I don't want everything to be really stark and crisp and clear up here. I want it to feel like light weakens the further it gets from that really intense bright light source above. Cast shadow on this side, the shape of the nose compromised with the shape of the face. So that comes forward, then it kind of meets up. I like how it meets up with that form shadow edge around the outside of the buccal fat on the other side. So that would all be coalesced into a shape. And then we'd have a cast shadow from the form of the kind of outside corner of the mouth coming out across the chin. The chin is a box that comes forward on men pretty dramatically and then back. And then we pick up a form shadow here. And this form shadow would be a ball. But maybe I just push that value a little bit more. Create the feeling or the association with light being weaker in this area. And then I'm going to light my fat. Sounded weird? Yeah. We can light this area of fat and then maybe show how that relates to the groups in with the shape under the mouth. So this would get fuller, kind of back and up, and then it starts to hit in with the back of the jaw, right? Kind of the area around the masseter. Then let's finish off here around the eye. So a lot of that hot light above is creating a cast shadow from the skull onto the planes of the nose, down. So this hits with that malar fat that's dropping. You can see how this buckles and changes to kind of dip around and across the fat that starts to drop underneath the eye. That's the lack of that orbital septum getting weaker. And then how this line picks up and rolls across what would be some of the lateral fat on the outside of the eye, caused by a cast shadow from the upper lid. And then that would be a form shadow for the upper lid. And then we'd have a cast shadow above from the socket onto the upper lid. So all C curves and S curves still going across those forms. And then when you're done, you can just do your paint bucket or just kind of paint it in with one value. And this would be my staging for a light and shadow drawing. Right? So I'd get my 3 values. This would be me keying the drawing, just starting it. So now I'd have my light or my whitest white, which might be the light of the page in my drawing, or in the picture it might be the forehead is the lightest area. I have my darkest dark, which is the core shadow. That's that value 9 or 10. And then I have an average value 5, which would be the fill value here. And then once I have this, I would decide, I usually just render one side of the value scale. So I would develop the halftones in the light, or I would develop the darker halftones in the shadow for the purposes of creating a focal point and not creating a lot of competition around that area. So I would want the focal point to have more information, crisper treatment, and then everything else would be less specific, less important. So for example, if you wanted to work in the halftone, then I would just start using that softer edge to describe the turns. So what I did with line here is being developed now with value and edge. That just describes the surface turning down and then out, right? If we break up the values into 1, 5, 10, I gave you the 3 keys, and now I'm to decide that I'll add, let's say 2 and 3, or maybe 2, 3, and 4, or maybe just start by adding an additional value in the light. So this is my demo or my explanation for aging, and then how you could take those forms and through their understanding start to put together a more finished look for the shading of the face.